Thank you so much, Louisa. It's really a pleasure to be here. I've heard so much about Pepperdine and how gorgeous it is, but truly I do not know how you guys get work done. Louisa thanked me for being here, and I was like, oh, well, you know, it's quite a hardship coming to Malibu and taking strolls on the beach and seeing this gorgeous view when I could be in Norman, Oklahoma. So it's really nice to be here, and I've heard so many good things about your program. And I think I have a clicker here. Let's see. Okay, looks self-explanatory. I haven't practiced with it yet, but I think it'll be fine.
Yeah, the microphone is not...
Is the microphone not working?
Right? So the microphone is not for her voice, right? So you have to be loud, I think.
Oh, okay. Louder. So can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay. Yes? Okay, good. I was thinking it wasn't. Yeah. Okay, very good. So as Louisa said, the political economy of free markets and economic development, turning conventional wisdom on its head. I think even if you don't have a lot of economics background, I think most people here or everybody here has a good sense that the United States is richer than Mexico. Most of the immigration problems or immigration issues that the United States face revolve around Mexico and migrants coming up from Mexico and not the other way around. It wasn't always this way, though. So here's my clicker. Yes, okay. It wasn't always this way. And this is something that I first learned when I got into economic development that I thought was fascinating, that there's been this economic divergence. If you think about it, Spain really went first in the colonization of the New World. And they chose the areas that they thought were the best, which tended to be the ones with lots of Native Americans that you could sort of enslave, exploit, and ones with a lot of mineral riches. England went second and got what remained. And if you've studied English history at all, you know that they basically came to the United States. Well, I'm calling it the United States. It obviously wasn't the United States. I'm going to do that as a shortcut. And I apologize, I know it's not correct, but they came to the mainland and to a good extent died. The first experiments tended to be pretty fatal. Everybody died, didn't work out well. Not a lot of Native Americans to enslave, no obvious riches. In fact, when England got Canada, policymakers were arguing to the king that this was ridiculous. Why in the world would you get a pile of snow? Nobody had ever made anything of themselves at that latitude, and that they should have gotten a Caribbean island. That was the way to go. You could, grow tobacco and sugar, and Canada was just a waste of time. So it wasn't the case. It hasn't always been the case that the U.S. and Canada were richer. So these are really serious estimates when we go back further in time. This is by a guy named Angus Madison. These are sort of real per capita income. Average per capita income estimates. So if you look 2008, this is sort of what we would know now. Mexico's real per capita income is about $8,000, the US about $31,000, so on average it's about 31% of what it is in the United States. This is held steady from about 1870, but back in the 1700s, Mexico was considered much richer than what was the United States at that time. But by the end of the colonial period, 1820, it had dropped to 54%. 50 years, if you know anything about Mexican history, the 50 years after independence were not kind to Mexico, so it dropped even more. But really, this is the period of time where things went wrong for Mexico. Question is, why? What went wrong? And what I'm going to argue today is that a lot of it had to do with kind of trade policies that Spain and England had for their colonies in the New World. Spain tended to have very regulated bureaucratic, or they tried to, we're going to talk about that, very regulated bureaucratic trade, and England promoted free trade in its colonies in the New World. And that, I believe, was key to creating entrepreneurship and a commercial culture in the United States that was absent in Mexico. Or maybe not completely absent, but less so in Mexico. And the turning the conventional wisdom on its head, I'll talk more about this later, but I don't know if you guys are familiar with Nobel Prize winner Douglas North, but he He's gotten a lot of stuff right in his life, right? He's got a Nobel Prize, so he's gotten a lot right. Very smart guy. But he had to say about Spain is that Spain was extremely absolutist, very centralized, very bureaucratic, tried to control everything, and that is why they had trade like this. I'm going to argue that's exactly the opposite. That England was the one that had a strong state, strong institutions, and because of that, they were able to promote free trade. That Spain chose the type of trade policies that they did because they were a very weak state. And so this is linking economic development with political development. And at the end, I'll talk about what are the implications for, this is sort of historical, I'll talk about the implications for real-world developing countries nowadays, what kind of conclusions we can draw. Okay, so did Mexico and the U.S. diverge economically because they had different colonial legacies? My argument is going to be yes, to a good extent. All right, first let's look at what kind of trade policies they had and a little bit about geography. Okay, ignore the blue routes because that's Portugal. The white routes, these are the trade routes under the Spanish colonial system. And as you can see, first off, there's not a lot of routes. And that's one of the reasons that I think Douglas North said, okay, it's very managed. Spain was not really interested in efficiency, was not interested in having the colonies become producers of manufactured goods. Mostly they wanted these colonies for extractive purposes. Take out the silver, take out the gold, take it back to Spain. Okay, so all of colonial trade from Spain had to leave from Sevilla. And that's that red dot there that says SE, it got cut off. That's what that is. And so only one port was allowed to trade with the New World. And in theory, it was a convoy of ships that left once a year to supply the colonies. Now, this didn't always work. When Spain was involved in a war with England or with France, no ships showed up, which was very problematic. Okay, so they followed the trade winds. You can see the bottom white line. They followed the trade winds from Sevilla all the way to Havana, where they did refueling, restocking. At Havana, South American one went down to Panama. It went to Portobello, actually, in Panama, and then had to go overland because there was no Panama Canal at the time, right? Had to go overland, so carry everything in. Was reading about that's unbelievable, and down to Lima. This is not a very efficient trade system. So, let's say Argentina. Could they ship from this coast? No. They had to transfer all the way thousands of miles overland to Lima, then up to here, then overland to Portobello, then to Havana, then to Sevilla. Okay? And for Mexico, there was only one port that was cleared to trade with Spain, and that was Veracruz. Now, when Spain acquired the Philippines, they also allowed one more port, Acapulco. That was the official port, the only legal port that could trade with Asia, with the Philippines. The colonies were not supposed to trade with one another. That was illegal. So there was no intercolonial trade. And like I said, it was supposed to be an annual convoy, and it was very prescribed where it could go. You can't see it so well on here, but I did want to mention geography. Because Spain wasn't very interested in efficiency, it tended to put its capital cities in areas that were like elevated plateaus. This was good for security, and it was also good for health reasons. It tended to be outside of malarial regions. It was really bad for transportation. They tended to not be on navigable rivers, not near oceans. Transportation tended to be extremely tough. And this is going to be another problem that comes to haunt these countries, is that the capital cities are not very close to any kind of transportation means. Okay, I know you can't read the little words there. They give like the different routes for different commodities, which is sort of interesting. I can pass my presentation on to Louisa if you guys have interest in that. But one thing you see from the English overseas trade is that there's a lot more lines. So even if you don't know anything else about what's going on, there's a lot of lines. And you got England and Scotland shipping to, let's see, we got Boston, Newport, New York, Philadelphia, Norfolk, and Charleston. The colonies could trade amongst each other. They also traded heavily with the Caribbean, and they could export back to Europe, as could the Caribbean. So there's a lot of trade going on. In fact, England had a policy that any Englishman could ship and do commerce on the Atlantic Empire, or on the Atlantic Empire, on the Atlantic coast of their empire, and colonial shippers and merchants were considered Englishmen. So they could ship, they could be involved in commerce, and England had, they had some goods they were considered, they called them enumerated. They were like sugar and indigo and rice. These are things that you had to pay taxes on. You had to pay tariffs. Other than that, every other kind of commodity was traded. The price was completely determined by market forces, and it was free trade. Okay, so I think I've probably, one more thing. Hopefully convinced you that trade in the Spanish Empire and the English Empire were quite a bit different. Also, I wanted to mention geography, I forgot that. You can see where all the major cities are located in the British Empire. They are all located either right on the ocean, near good ports, or on very navigable rivers that get you to a good port quickly. And so it was all about trade. It was all about putting capitals in areas that would be conducive to trade. That's going to be very helpful in the future. Okay, trade and the development of a commercial culture. So they had different trade policies. The question is, so what? What does that mean? What does that do? One, as I brought up before, Spain may have had these centralized rules. These like everything has to go in this convoy and it goes once a year. That doesn't mean that it actually worked that way. In fact, it was pretty much a failed policy. Sometimes for years at a time, the convoys didn't show up, and there was an enormous amount of smuggling. So you can see here some statistics. Smugglers conducted virtually all trade with Europe in the 1600s. This is from Mexico, including much of the exportation of silver. Silver was the export from Mexico. So you see here, some decades, over 50% of the silver that Mexico exported went illegally. So the argument I'm going to return to, Douglas North's argument that Spain had these restrictive policies because they were so overwhelmingly autocratic, is pretty ahistorical. They actually had very little control over what was going on. So smuggling brings about some kind of commercial culture. The problem is it's illegal. So because it's illegal, it doesn't bring the other things that Max Weber said were so important, like growing laws, rules, a system of rule of law, where the idea is that there's regulations and laws that are enforceable by impartial bureaucracies, impartial judicial systems for everyone involved. And actually going to read you a quote. Douglas North said, "It is important to have property rights that are internalized in people's consciousness and unconsciousness, embodied in multi-volume codes of laws and regulations, and enforced by impartial courts and professional bureaucracies." This is something that, so you do get some commercial culture with smuggling, but you don't get all the rest of the institutional development that you would get if it was actually legal. And you can see this, there's lots of examples of sort of how Mexico fell behind because of this, but one is when Spain was warring with France and there was this de facto ability for Mexico to trade with the United States, they benefited, but they didn't benefit as much as they could because there was no shipbuilding in Mexico. So unlike the United States, which had extensive shipbuilding, Mexicans did not have their own ships to trade with the United States or with any other country, and so that really held them back and prevented them from capturing all the benefits that they could have. Okay, entrepreneurship in British America. Now, I'm obviously oversimplifying for the purposes of this lecture. This book is like really long. and really, really detailed. So I'm trying not to get into too many details and bore you guys. Just to sort of give you the Cliff Notes version. But early trade, say like within the mainland, with the Caribbean, required colonists to develop entrepreneurial skills. There was little money, little silver that was around, and so most of the trade was in barter, so in kind, so one good for another good. What that meant is that these merchants then came back with all these goods that they didn't want, right? It's not like they came back with silver and then they could buy what they wanted. They came back with all these in-kind goods and then they had to dispose of them. So what this did is meant that it got involved in retail trade of selling these things back home, which only increased commercial culture back in the mainland. And they also tended to do things like invest their money in timberland and sawmills, raised horses and cattle, and they had an incredible amount of flexibility and set of abilities that were to be really helpful later on. As the population increased and expanded geographically too, different areas, if you, I know you couldn't see it on that English trade map, but you can see that different regions specialized in different commodities, and this was really helpful. And it was also meant that different colonies would start trading with one another because of the specialization. And when they did that, they were very interested in improving transportation. So roads got increasingly better between the ports, and there was also better integration between the north and the south. Speaking of which, transportation. I mentioned that Spain was not really interested in efficient transportation. And when I first put together this talk, so one of my favorite parts is transportation for some reason. I had so many slides on transportation, I was like, okay, that's going to be like the whole presentation. So I cut it back. It's amazing how little Spain paid attention to transportation. And they spent like no money, no time, no maintenance. It was shocking. Like they had in Peru, they found the Incan roads, and they're like, oh, okay, that's fine, we'll use those. Mexico, they didn't even really have that. So by 1800, this is like almost 300 years of colonial rule. There was only a single roadway in I'm calling Mexico, it was actually New Spain, was its official title, existed. And that's a huge territory, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. That's a gigantic territory. Only one roadway existed that was suitable for wheeled traffic over its entire length. And even on this highway, mule trains outnumbered wheeled traffic. So if you read about like the transportation system, it's really shocking. Like Veracruz was not a good place to put a port. It's like Cortez got there and was like, he wasn't interested in trade. So it's like, that's where he landed, that's where the port's gonna be. And if you go into like what makes a good port, which is something I never thought about, Veracruz was not a good port at that time. It was beset with yellow fever all the time and malaria. People tried to get out of there as soon as possible. But just even like the water and stuff like that, what you need for a good port was not good. And then the transportation was, even after independence, this mining company, after all the bloody wars of independence, mining company wanted to import machinery for its mines. And it was 350 miles away from Veracruz. And it took 1 year to get the equipment, and the cost of transportation doubled the price of all the machinery. So not really good, conducive for business and investment. So as late as the 1870s, so this is like, almost 50 years after independence, Mexico still had fewer than 5 kilometers of road passable by 4-wheeled carts. Per 10,000 inhabitants, less than 1/10 the U.S. figure. So anytime that you have transportation is so difficult, and it was so beset by bandits actually too, very insecure. This makes it very hard to have like a national market. So Mexico tended to have very regional markets. In fact, like beer in the Yucatan, when you drank it elsewhere, was considered foreign. It was like, oh, that's that foreign beer from the Yucatan, even though Yucatan was part of Mexico. So you don't have the economies of scale. You don't get this national market when transportation is so poor. And like I said, Spain was little interested in it because they just wanted to get the silver out, and they didn't actually want there to be trade in other goods. This is a painting of shipbuilding in New England. In British America, colonists were allowed to build ships, and during the English Civil War, all of a sudden they found that they needed ships because the British were busy with their own stuff. So they started New England really got busy building ships because they wanted to fish off of Newfoundland. They wanted to trade with the Caribbean. And so they started large-scale shipbuilding. The king got into it too. He actually started subsidizing New England shipbuilding and to a huge extent. And by 1775, so the very end of the colonial period, 1/3 of the British fleet had been built in Massachusetts. So there was a culture of shipbuilding, of knowing, having the expertise, knowing how that worked, which is really going to help in terms of a commercial culture and being able to trade with other countries after the colonial period. All right, colonial legacies. Let's talk a little bit. There's lots of arguments about what the colonial legacies are. They don't all revolve around trade, but that's what I'm going to focus on today. Because Spain was not really all that interested in entrepreneurial behavior, was more interested in extraction, paid very little attention to protection of property rights. The contracts tended to be very hard to enforce. Obviously, this is terrible for developing commercial culture and encouraging business investment. There was no incentive after independence to create charter banks because the government was extremely predatory. So any pools of money the government would see and go, excellent, this is a great pool of money, we will take that, right? You see that all the time nowadays. I remember when Hugo Chavez in Venezuela realized that the central bank had like all these foreign exchange reserves. And supposedly central bank in Venezuela was independent, but Chavez didn't care, so he was like, oh, we're going to use this for rural development instead of, which, anyways, is really not done in central banking. The central bank governor was horrified. So no one wanted to place their money where the government might just take it. So let's combine all our money in a bank where the government can then see it and take it. And there were 0 charter banks until 1863 in Mexico, and only 1 from then on until the 1880s. Not having charter banks is going to really hurt in terms of developing a commercial culture as well. Let me see if I can put this back on. Okay. This is a photo of a very old textile mill. I don't know if you guys have read Stephen Haber, but he has a very nice comparison. It's a paper that looks at development of textiles in U.S. and Mexico in the 1800s. And it's really illuminating, I think. The reason he chooses textiles is because the only real obstacle to opening a textile mill was getting financing. Clearly, that was a big obstacle, but it tended to, textiles, you didn't need to have large economies of scale. There were no significant patents which prevented people from starting a textile mill. There was widespread availability of resources, of textiles, of cotton. And so there weren't very many barriers to entry. So he looks and sees, given that, let's see what financial development was like in Mexico and what it was like in the United States. All right, in Mexico, there was very little access to impersonal finance. Right, go back to this slide. There were no charter banks. Charter banks meaning just being banks that were official banks according to the licensed by the government. Okay, so there were no charter banks. So finance was very personal, not impersonal. If you wanted money, you had to get it from relatives and friends. So kinship networks is how you got money to start a firm. Even as late as 1930, so more than 100 years after independence of Mexico, most of Mexico's textile industry was financed through kinship networks and not through any kind of raising money from banks or through equity. Equity finance through the creation of joint stock companies was essentially unknown throughout the 19th century in Mexico. In the United States, there was a lot of options. And I'm just trying to show you guys sort of the development of a commercial culture in the United States. Firms could get loans from commercial banks, savings banks, trust companies, insurance companies, mercantile houses, manufacturing concerns, including other textile mills, which I find very bizarre. I'm not sure why you would lend money to another, sure, you want to start one too? And private individuals. So there was a big range from where you could get money to start a factory. And in 1835, there were 14 textile manufacturers listed on the Boston Stock Exchange. 30 years later, there were 40. So quite a big difference. If you look at output, Mexican textile industry was tiny compared to the United States. By 1890, output was in Mexico was 0.03% of what it was in the United States in terms of textile output. And it was much more concentrated in Mexico, about 3 to 4 times more concentrated. Okay. This may not be unconventional wisdom for you guys in public policy, I don't know. But sadly, it seems to be unconventional for economists. And partly that's because of the impact that Douglas North had on the economics field with what he had to say about Spain, and Spain being sort of this monolithic, very bureaucratic, very authoritarian state that regulated trade down to the minutia, as opposed to England, which we argue, my co-author and I argue in the book, is exactly the opposite. That political development is needed, institutions are needed to have a modern market economy. It's funny because when we had historians review the book, they were like, yeah, duh, like, we know that. They're like, we know that Spain's not like that. And we've known that for years. But economists, for some reason, we just haven't gotten it through our heads. So I don't know if it's unconventional for everybody, but it certainly seems to be in economics. Okay, here's a quote from a Spanish, well, it's an Englishman, but he's a famous historian on Spain. He writes, "We may overthrow the idea that the trade system operating in the New World consisted of a dominant official trade and a secondary informal one consisting of contraband." In fact, he argues that it would be pointless to call the Spanish system a breakdown because it never reached the point where you could call it functioning properly. So it's not like there was these periodic breakdowns where the Spanish system didn't work. It never worked. It never worked well. There was never enough to supply the colonies, and the colonies would have completely failed if they had not been able to smuggle goods from elsewhere. All right, Spain as a weak state. Unlike what Douglas North said, we argue in our book that the biggest weakness of Spain was not the fact that it was overly bureaucratic, but it had almost no bureaucracy. It really was extremely weak up until 1700s, but really the late 1700s is when it started to form a more modern bureaucracy. And without an effective bureaucracy, Spain was doomed to sort of a personalistic, monarchic process in which options and trade-offs, at least from our perspective, don't seem to be properly weighed, at least in terms of economic efficiency. So rulers could not trust the market because they were incapable of taxing decentralized economic activity. And I wanted to give you an example. I'll give you one here in a couple minutes too, but an example of the lack of bureaucratic ability. And this is supposed to be of the highly centralized, highly bureaucratic state. So you guys have all probably heard of the Spanish Armada. King Philip, or Felipe of Spain, decided to overthrow England with the Spanish Armada, with the Spanish ships. At the time, Spain's Defense Department had one person and a couple of clerks that assisted this person. None of these people had ever been in the military or had any military experience. So when he decided that he was going to overthrow England, he said, well, we need to double the size of the secretaries. We need one for the Navy and one for the Army, and that's it. Okay, so now we got 2 people in the Ministry of Defense, which is just amazing. And almost all of the ships, I did not realize, almost all the ships in the Spanish Armada were actually not Spanish. They were rented from Genoa. And many of them, almost all of them were sunk in the attack. It went very, very badly for Spain. And but Philip didn't even try to replace them. England was like building up its merchant fleet like crazy, and they're like, Spain was like, I don't know. Didn't even try to sort of replace the ships that they lost. And I don't know what this made me think, because I had to rent a car recently. I was like, You know when you rent a car like in Europe and they're like, okay, but you can't drive to Italy? Or like you rent in San Diego and they're like, okay, but you can't take it to Tijuana? I'm just wondering like what the Genoans said after they're like, yes, we parked the boats at the bottom of the sea near Bristol. You can pick them up. You can rent our boats, but you cannot attack England with them.
Yeah.
Just thought that would be like an awkward conversation afterwards. Yes, those boats we rented. There was this little war that we sort of lost. The idea that you rent the boats and then take them to attack another country, just, I don't know. Different times, but it cracked me up. I also wanted to point this out too. This is a map of New Spain, the yellow. And I've been calling it Mexico. It wasn't actually Mexico, it was New Spain, was the colony, and it was gigantic. So you can see it includes much of what is currently the United States. You've got Louisiana, takes up a huge amount, government of New California, Florida. It included Cuba, included all of Central America. It's not shown there, but it also includes Venezuela, modern day Venezuela, and it included the Philippines. So this was a gigantic territory for one colony. And there was a viceroy who was in charge and a couple of clerks. Now, there were people at like local, there were other people at different levels, but as we'll see soon, a lot of those positions were bought, and the viceroy had no ability to fire or hire on his own. So you can imagine that kind of territory with one guy and a couple of secretaries. And I remember one of the viceroys complaining and demanding like a doubling of his secretaries because all communication had to be handwritten, and I was like, oh my gosh. That was something. So it was 15 times larger than Western Europe, and it had no provincial organs, no provincial institutions to coordinate orderly administrative lines of command. So for instance, there were 3 tax agencies in New Spain, one for the Spanish sector, for the Spaniards working there, one for agriculture, and one for the Native Americans. None of these institutions were staffed with people that the viceroy could fire or hire. They were all sold by the Spanish king to the highest bidder. And the viceroy had no real military force in the core areas of the colony. If you know anything about Mexican history, it's amazing how, like, that the Hidalgo rebellion, like, just took down. I mean, it's amazing what kind of effect it had, and partly that's because there was really no military force in the colony. Okay, so this is strengthening bureaucracy. This is actually about England. A lot of people, of course, point to 1688 in England as a watershed moment. We argue that one of the biggest implications of 1688 was the rapid growth of the bureaucracy. And that meant that Parliament had to approve laws. It had to approve laws and budgets. Now, mostly this was rubber stamp at this time, but it meant that the king and the bureaucracy actually had to draft well-structured laws and budgets. And policymaking became much more regularized than just the king saying, yeah, you were going to do this. And they actually started to have the beginnings of a sort of a modern bureaucracy and some consistency. In 1688, the English bureaucracy had 2,500 people. And within less than 30 years, it had 12,000. So there was a huge growth in bureaucracy. Well, we tend to think of bureaucracy as being a very negative thing. In this book, we argue that it's actually very much needed. Now, there's probably a level at which you could have too much bureaucracy, but you need an impartial bureaucracy. You need institutions that actually work. In the British system, local authorities, as you can see, the colonies were very small. In the British system, local authorities were given responsibility for local taxation and administration of those taxes, both in England and in the colonies on the mainland. Each colony had a 2-house legislature, and these bodies were in charge of local taxation and in charge of the local militia. Now, the governor and England also had a veto, but within some range, they had some ability to control taxation and the administration thereof. Britain didn't have very many administrators in its colonies, but in some sense it didn't need to, because control was based more implicitly on the fact that the elite were integrated into the commercial culture. So they were interested in things like strengthening transportation, strengthening property rights, things that would increase their ability to trade. And also, the governor tended to know all the members of the elite in and near around the capital. And he also tended to have the power to block projects that they might be working on in London. So he had some strings to make sure that people played nicely and that people were sort of on the same page. How am I doing on time? 12:45. Okay. I know some of you guys have to leave you have a class at 1. So I'll try to be brief here. Political development is important for economic development. This is something that economists shouldn't really be all that surprising, but I think we were very surprised, say with like the dismantling of the central command economies of the Soviet Union and the communist states. We sort of thought that automatically there would just emerge this free market, but not realizing that there weren't the institutions to actually promote sort of fair level playing field. There wasn't the judicial system. There wasn't a competent government, and what you ended up with in some cases were like rampant kleptocracy instead of a modern market economy. So this is one of our main arguments in the book, is that creation, say in Europe, of the modern market involved replacement of personalistic subsidies, monopoly guilds and privileges and decrees by early rulers, and replace them with impersonal laws and rules and regulations that should be applied impartially. Not to say that it always does, but that's the idea. Second, development takes time. This is something that we really forget. So Douglas North, when he accepted his Nobel Prize, he said, how can one prescribe when one doesn't understand how economies develop? Neoclassical economics contains 2 erroneous assumptions. First, that institutions do not matter, and second, that time does not matter. So I think that he has really helped to solve the first one by bringing institutional economics on the map and showing us that institutions do matter. But I don't think we have taken seriously in economics the idea that time matters too. We tend to collapse down, the fact that, it took 800 years in England, or it took 400 years. And I'm not saying that it has to take that long now. You don't have to necessarily reinvent the whole wheel. But the idea that countries should somehow just be able to just jump right to where we are at is very ahistorical and very ignorant of our own history and how difficult it was. And if you guys have read Hernando de Soto's books, it's very interesting, like The Mystery of Capital. He gives some great examples of how difficult it was in the United States. He talked to people who deal with property rights in the United States nowadays, and none of them had any idea about how long it took. And so he goes back and traces it and how incredibly messy it was in the United States. And for instance, George Washington had squatters on his land, and they wouldn't leave. And so he consulted with a lawyer and said, what can I do? I'm thinking of kicking them off. And he said, no, don't kick them off. There's come back and burn down your property, and you won't have any recourse. So he said, that's basically it. Early Supreme Court justice said it looked like the United States is always going to be a nation of squatters, that we will never be able to figure out property rights effectively, and sort of like threw up his hands that this was never going to work. So we've sort of collapsed all that down and think like, well, we figured it out, right? How, not realizing that it was a really messy, non-linear process, and to expect developing countries to do it automatically is really ahistorical and idealistic. Institutional mimicry, this is something that Lant Pritchett and Michael Woolcock call skipping straight to Weber or skipping straight to Denmark. They use Denmark as sort of like the prototypical rich country, and the idea is like, just go right, see what we're doing, do that. And people, you think like, okay, no one would really do that, right? But they do. I remember when I interviewed with the World Bank, the woman who was interviewing me told me in all seriousness, gosh, I don't know, we tried this police reform that had worked so well in New Zealand, and we tried it in Mexico City, and it just didn't work at all because of the corruption. I was like, New Zealand, if you look at corruption, it's always like the least corrupt country in the world. Like, really? You thought that was like the conditions were ceteris paribus? Like, they just like won and shock, it didn't work. So Pritchett and Wilcox say they call this skipping straight to Weber because this form did not emerge from an internal historical process of trial and error and a political struggle as it did in most European and North American countries. Instead, countries tried to quickly reach these performance goals by simply mimicking institutions that rich countries have or adopting them in the case of colonial cases. Like, okay, there's this rich country, we'll just take these institutions. It doesn't necessarily work that way. And second best solutions is something that Danny Roderick has brought up, which is, I think, worth looking at in economics, and that is to really recognize where developing countries are at, where their institutions are at, and how can we work with that as opposed to where we would like them to be. Like, we're just going to assume that there's no corruption, that there's no any of these other problems, that they have the institutional capability of doing these things. We'll just assume that and see how it goes. The second best solution is looking at, given that they don't have these capabilities, what's the best thing that we can do? For instance, some sub-Saharan African countries have done what European countries did, and that is to farm out their taxes. They don't have the institutional capability of collecting taxes very well, and so they hire private firms to do that for them, which, if you go back in history, was done all the time in every single European country. And I'm not saying I'm not necessarily recommending that, I just think it's interesting. It's not something I can imagine the World Bank saying to do, but it's trying to deal with the environment, the situation that they have at the moment. And again, I don't think that I think there are some things that we've learned. I don't think you have to tell developing countries like, yeah, it's going to take you about 400 years, but don't worry, you'll get there. I think we can probably speed the process up. I think some countries have definitely sped the process up, but I think it's worth realizing that you do need political capacity in thinking about how to build that too. So that's it. Thank you very much. Yes, Eric.
So did England have more, I guess, of a regulated trade because they more or less were under one crown, and they had a tradition of having no government, so they had more time for these traditions to develop, as opposed to Spain, who was two kingdoms, and they had just, I guess, they had to kick out the Moors from Spain, and then after they kicked them out, they had to form one government, so it was a new government, and then they had, out of nowhere, they had colonies. So is that why, because they had just formed a new government, that they do not have those traditions to be able to apply in New Spain and America?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a complex one too. One of the things that we argue is that, using geography again, that Britain did well is that it focused on getting, I don't want to call it good government, but better government in London, in terms of getting like actual government capability in London and ruling London, and then it started spreading out more and more and being a more capable state from that. So it didn't try to overreach, did a very small area. Spain, on the other hand, when it started, it never really had all that much total control over Castile, but then when it started getting other regions of Spain, huge amounts of territory and very little state penetration in those territories. So I think that was also a big difference. You can develop much more of a commercial culture, say, in London versus a really wide, huge area, expansive area, which you didn't have much. That's the other funny thing, which I didn't cover in this talk at all, and that is that I was showing you how Spain was a weak state relative to, with respect to its colonies, but it was really a weak state in its own too, because trying to, you have like, different areas that are demanding, they still demand, right, their own, like Catalonia or something, they still demand to have their own language and their own rules, their own laws, their own cultures. So it was much more of what they call a composite state than England was. So that probably also changed things up in terms of commercial culture. Anybody else? Yes?
You said that the difference between, or one of the major differences between British America and New Spain was that there was free trade, but in New Spain there wasn't. And so it was just kind of the exporting of silver. So
right.
Was there a fear there, or why didn't they allow trade to go on?
I think there was that's a tough question too, because there seems to be a lot of elements. One is that I don't think they felt like they could capture the benefits of it in terms of taxation, so they didn't want to necessarily encourage it. Also, I think they were afraid that the colonies would become developed on their own. The more manufactured goods they have, the more likely they are to want independence, demand independence. So I think they seemingly were quite happy with keeping them in a relatively poor state and taking out the minerals. It's probably a big oversimplification, but I think that's some of it. Yes.
Will you take one from the cameraman?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Well, I want to ask you a little more about what you elaborate a little bit on what you think about it in terms of development policy. We had another speaker, I think it was last year, William Easterly,
Oh yeah.
who kind of was arguing the problem is development experts and everything are not focusing enough on human rights, and in other words, the free markets and human rights and free press and all these things, those really need to go. Development has focused purely on economics and hasn't focused on religious freedom, press freedom, those things that really need to be joined together. Am I
Yes.
correct in saying you're suggesting maybe more of the model like Singapore or Oman has had a lot of economic development in the last 40 years without focusing on sort of the human rights? In other words, there may be a contradiction there. Actually, what is needed first is strong political institutions, maybe even centralized political institutions. Is that
Well, yeah, it's nonlinear because I would hate to say that what they need is authoritarian government. I don't think it necessarily has to be authoritarian, but it has to be capable. And so there's this nonlinear relationship where you want to have the state to have authority and capability, but you don't want it to be repressive. And so there's a lot of talk today because Lee Kuan Yew just died, right, today?
Right.
Yeah, and about the legacy of Singapore. And I'm always so mixed on Singapore because I think economists focus way too much on economic liberty and not on political liberty. They really downplay, like, they say I know a lot of economists that say they're like all for liberty, but then when you mention political liberty, they're like, people don't know enough to know what's good for them. We know what's good for them, which is really sort of distasteful. So no, I don't think I would argue for that necessarily. Part of the problem, and Easterly might have mentioned this, is that the World Bank is loath to get into the issues of sovereignty. If it's in a state and if it's helping out a state and it's dictating things like religious liberty or freedom of the, it's going to be pretty sensitive topics for that domestic government. So it's tended to stay away from those. So the question is, how do you bring about economic development while still bringing out these other things that are really important? I'm glad you asked that because I don't want to give the impression that like have a strong authority. I mean, it's true that East Asian countries have had a lot of economic development quickly through very strong authoritarian states. But I think if you take of the history of authoritarian states throughout like man's history, and you look at the percentage of times that they've been had good economic policies, I think they're tiny. You guys? If I could say, well, we're just going to pull a dictator out of the hat of human history and hope for the best, what do you guys think? No thanks. Most, so it's like, well, there have been some cases, but I think there's been 99% have been really, really bad for economic development and everything, any other kind of development too. So I would always really hate to say what you need is a good dictator. Yeah.
Well, my question is kind of related to Chris.
Sure.
How do they make it work? I mean, for the extractive system to function with such a little transportation, and how do they end up getting all the resources out, right? And then think a little bit about how their colonial experience kind of doomed them when they became independent, right? Because they really didn't have
much industry.
They didn't have transportation. I mean, it really make a huge difference between Mexico and the United States.
Right.
When you think about what do you do after independence, right? It's not like you start with a clean slate.
Right.
But if you're already a mess, then
yes.
How do you go from that, right?
Exactly, and you mostly traded with Spain.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they did finally legalize some intercolonial trade at the very end of the colonial period, but you mostly traded with Spain, and all of a sudden Spain's your enemy. Spain's the one you just got independence from, so all your trade ties are gone. So they were left with sort of a zero slate. Or, you know, they started negative. But you were asking, how did they get the silver?
I'm just thinking, you know, about the infrastructure you mentioned.
It's amazing.
If
like,
you are like extractive colony, I mean, at least you will have a little bit of more interest on like getting out your resources more efficiently. But it seems that it was very messy, right? And probably because that's how Spain was, anyways, and they could do it better, right?
They were able to monopolize it somewhat because you needed mercury, and I don't know the chemical processes, but you needed mercury for the amalgamation process of extracting silver.
Okay.
And Spain, there were two supplies, one in Spain and one in Potosi, and they wouldn't allow Potosi to sell to New Spain. So Spain had the monopoly on mercury, which allowed the silver miners then to mine. So they had that leverage over them. But if you look at like the transportation, I mean, they should have been interested in better roads even for transporting silver.
Yeah.
I mean, like over the mountains and stuff. You read these examples, you're like, I mean, many months of just, you know, sometimes like a bridge is gone, so then, okay, we're going to be here for 6 months until we build a new bridge, and it's really amazing. And once they stopped using Native American workers as like exploiting them for using them for manual labor, then they were like, well, Spaniards are too expensive, so we just won't maintain the roads. It's like then they went to nothing. It's sort of counterintuitive, I think, that they really didn't pay any attention to roads.
I mean, it was on their interest.
It was, some of the things that Spain did, like you can't even figure out like why exactly.
But that tells you about the messiness that they had in
their messy
country, right?
Exactly.
So
I mean, you have some cases in Spain where like there's one king, I can't remember his name, but like nobody's written a biography of him because he was considered like a very limited intelligence is the way they put it. And so it's like then, you know, I have like 20 years of like just, you know, really bad policy making. And when it's at the whim of one person who doesn't have a wide circle of like specialized ministries informing them. For instance, the ministries of the Indies, none of them had ever been to the Indies. None of them had been to the New World. So they're advising the king, but none of them had actually gone. None of them had any experience there. And it's sort of amazing. Then you end up with things like that, like England took advantage of sugar production way before Spain did. Spain was, even though they saw England doing it, they were like, I don't know. It took them forever to start doing that, and just a lot of things they were very, very slow on. And when they finally started to modernize the bureaucracy, they used England as an example. They said, look at their ports, look at their wharfs, look at their roads, look at the trade, we need to do this. And so they definitely used it as an example of how they wanted to be.
How diversified was Mexico's economy at the time of independence?
I don't have any numbers. It was starting to get more diversified. I mean, not in terms of really manufactured goods, but it was starting to get more of a commercial culture. Spain was finally, with the Bourbons, they started to realize that we need to follow more of what England's doing. We need to have more regularized, we need to stop selling positions. We need to have more regularized control. We need to try to control tax administration. We need to allow trade between the colonies. And I think, so I don't know, the Mexican economy was starting to get, I think, more capitalistic, more commercial, but it still was, I think, lagging way behind. And then I think it's hard to know what would have happened because it's like as soon as Spain started on these more rational policies, then they had the war with France, and Napoleon put his brother on the Spanish crown. Like, okay, my brother Joe is going to be, whatever his name was, he's going to be now the Spanish king. And then from that point on, it was just chaos. And then you got the wars of independence, which were incredibly damaging to Mexico, and then sort of 50 years of anarchy to a certain extent. You know, war after war after war. So it's hard to know, like, if Spain had started the modernization before. That's what makes it hard to say what the Spanish legacy is, because they had started a new legacy. You know, it's always changing. It's hard to define what the legacy is, but they had started a much better legacy for Mexico. And I'm not saying that Mexico should have stayed with Spain longer, but it's, you know, if they had started earlier, it would have been interesting to see where Mexico would have, how Mexico would have done in the 19th century. Okay.
If there are no more questions, then we'll thank Dr. Grier for her.
Thank you, guys.
And still hang out a little more if you have more questions. I know some of you have class.